On the night of March 15th, 1847, a scream tore across the Virginia countryside so strange and chilling that no one in Cumberland County could mistake it for an animal cry or the moan of childbirth. When dawn came, the horror behind that sound was revealed. 13 members of the Peton family were found slaughtered inside their plantation home, their bodies arranged with a precision that suggested not rage, but method. Court documents kept hidden for decades later revealed how clean and deliberate the cuts were, so exact they seemed the work of someone trained in anatomy. The only person accused was a man known only as Isaac, an enslaved worker who vanished that same night, leaving behind evidence that confounded even the most experienced lawmen and raised unsettling questions about the very foundations of slavery in Virginia. Before this story of Isaac and the Peton plantation continues, imagine yourself standing in Cumberland County that spring. The land was rich, rolling with green tobacco fields, the James River winding like a lifeline through the countryside. The region thrived on the forced labor of enslaved people, a place where plantation owners built grand lives, while those they enslaved toiled from sunrise to dusk. At the heart of this prosperity stood Peton Grove, nearly 2,000 acres of prime soil, crowned by a massive 3-story home with white columns and wide porches that commanded a sweeping view of the estate. Built in the 1760s by Josiah Peton and passed down through 3 generations, it had become one of the county's most formidable properties. By 1847, control rested with Cornelius Peton, Josiah's grandson, a shrewd man with steel-gray eyes and a reputation for personally overseeing every detail of plantation life. Unlike many of his peers, Cornelius rarely relied on overseers, preferring his own tight grip on both profits and people. His wife, Margaret, came from a wealthy Richmond banking family, and together they raised 4 children: Samuel, Elizabeth, Thomas, and little Mary, along with Cornelius's widowed mother, Prudence, Margaret's sister Catherine, and Cornelius's brother Jonathan, a physician whose frequent visits lent the household an air of refinement. Yet what truly set the Peton estate apart wasn't its grand home or fertile acres, but the troubling way Cornelius built his enslaved workforce. While most planters bought their laborers from major markets, Cornelius had a peculiar habit of acquiring men and women other masters had labeled dangerous or unmanageable. This choice puzzled his neighbors, but no one could have guessed how it would play into the blood-stained night when the Peton family's legacy came to a shocking end. Isaac came to Peton Grove in the fall of 1844, brought there through Cornelius Peton's unusual practice of buying enslaved men and women that others considered too difficult to control. Isaac had been sold off from a plantation in Prince Edward County where he worked in the slaughterhouse. His former master, Fielding Crawford, was eager to be rid of him, hinting at unsettling incidents that were never fully recorded. Isaac stood more than 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, oversized hands, and eyes so pale they seemed almost without color. His silence was unnerving, not because he was simple, but because he listened, studied, and observed with unnerving intensity. What made him valuable was his extraordinary skill with a blade. He could dress livestock faster and cleaner than anyone, cutting joints and organs with surgical accuracy, never wasting meat, and somehow finishing the messiest tasks without a drop of blood staining his clothes. But it was the rumors surrounding him that unsettled those around him. Stories of livestock found butchered beyond necessity, their bodies arranged in ways no one could explain, and of Isaac lingering near the carcasses as though studying them. Crawford accepted nearly a third less than Isaac's assessed value just to be rid of him, requiring only that Isaac never be sold back into Prince Edward County. Cornelius considered it a bargain. For nearly 3 years, Isaac worked without incident at Peton Grove, overseeing meat production in a slaughterhouse he kept spotless, his knives lined like instruments in a surgeon's theater. By March of 1847, life at the plantation seemed steady. Margaret Peaton tended the gardens the children studied with their tutor from Richmond, and Cornelius pored over accounts that promised record profits from the year's tobacco crop. But beneath this calm, the first signs of something deeply wrong began to surface. It was Cornelius's brother, Dr. Jonathan Peaton, who noticed it. He had arrived the night before to tend to enslaved workers with influenza and intended to check on them again the following day. By afternoon, the quarters were disturbingly quiet. At first, he thought the patients were resting. But as he approached, an acrid metallic smell carried on the breeze made him stop short. The source became clear when he saw Isaac's cabin. Its door left ajar, a rare thing for a man known to guard his privacy. On the threshold were stains, dark and unmistakable, the rusty hue of dried blood. Trained to recognize it, the doctor knew immediately this wasn't from a minor cut. Something violent had happened here. With unease rising, he pushed the door open. Inside, the sparse cabin had been transformed into something grotesque. A space that looked less like a living quarter and more like a display of horror. A place where ordinary order had been replaced by a scene that defied belief. Inside Isaac's cabin, what first appeared orderly soon revealed itself as a scene of calculated horror. His few possessions were lined with unsettling precision, but it was what dangled from the rafters that stopped Dr. Jonathan Peaton cold. At first glance, the shapes hanging from ropes looked like butchered hogs, their weight pulling against cords cut to exact lengths. But as the light shifted through the single grimy window, the doctor's stomach turned. The forms were human. The proportions, the cleanly separated joints, the way organs had been carefully removed. This was no slaughterhouse refuse. This was deliberate, systematic butchery. Jonathan's medical training made the truth undeniable. Whoever had done this possessed not only a mastery of anatomy, but the patience and detachment of a surgeon. The cuts weren't frantic or cruel in the usual sense. They were efficient, exact, as though the human body had been reduced to little more than livestock to be processed. Staggering back across the plantation grounds, Jonathan's horror deepened. The plantation was wrong. Silence still stripped of the usual rhythm of life. No clatter from the fields, no laughter of children, not even the scent of food fires. An eerie hush clung to everything. When he reached the main house, the front door stood ajar, an impossibility under Margaret's ever-watchful eye. Calling out yielded only silence. Inside the dining table was frozen mid-meal plates of food left untouched, the sheen of grease gone dull. In the parlor, Margaret's embroidery remained draped across her chair, the needle dangling by a thread of silk. Everything felt paused, interrupted in an instant. At the staircase, Jonathan's gaze fell on a trail of dark stains, soaking into the carpet, forming a dragged pattern that led upward. Compelled, though nearly undone, he followed. The study was where the nightmare sharpened into something unforgettable. Cornelius Peaton sat where he always did, in his leather chair behind the broad mahogany desk, posture eerily natural, as though still attending to his ledger. But his head was gone, carefully severed and placed upright on the polished surface, staring across the room like some ghastly ornament. Nothing in the room suggested a fight. The order of the scene, the neatness, the calm arrangement, was far more chilling than chaos could ever be. Moving through the house in a state of disbelief, Jonathan found the same fate had come to every member of the family. In the master bedroom, Margaret's body remained seated at her dressing table, flowers at hand, her severed head posed among the blooms she had been arranging. It was grotesque and strangely composed, as if art had been made from atrocity. In the nursery, the children were discovered as though mid-play, their small bodies arranged in tableaus that mocked the innocence of games, turned instead into silent scenes of death. The children, Samuel Elizabeth Thomas and little Mary, were found arranged in a circle on the nursery floor, their bodies posed as if mid-play. but their heads severed with the same exacting cut had been placed together in the center, facing one another as though locked in conversation. On the back porch, old Prudence rested in her rocking chair, her posture calm as if watching the fading light of day. Beside her, on a small table, sat her Bible spectacles and her own head positioned with the same eerie deliberation. Catherine was discovered in the kitchen apron, still tied around her waist, a lump of dough on the counter before her. Her head lay neatly on the cutting board, as if it were just another ingredient in her preparation. What unsettled Dr. Jonathan Peaton most was not only the precision of the killings, but the silence of the house itself. There was no blood spattered on walls, no stains soaking into the floorboards. The absence of gore made the horror even more surreal. It was as though each person had been killed elsewhere, drained of blood, and then carefully staged into domestic scenes that mocked the rhythms of ordinary life. Jonathan's physician's eye saw what others might have missed. The incisions were identical, executed with instruments of extraordinary sharpness. Each wound was a single flawless cut from behind, severing the major arteries and veins in one motion. None of the victims bore signs of resistance. They hadn't even known they were about to die. By the following morning, after Jonathan's frantic ride through the night, Sheriff Thomas Hawthorne arrived with 2 deputies and the county coroner, William Fitzgerald. Hawthorne was a veteran lawman who had dealt with murders of passion robberies turned bloody and even uprisings crushed with violence. Yet nothing in his 20 years of service had prepared him for what lay inside Peaton Grove. The mystery was twofold. How could one person have killed 13 people without a struggle? And how had the bodies been staged without leaving the expected carnage? There were no forced locks, no broken windows. Whoever had done this had either been invited in or had moved freely through the home. Coroner Fitzgerald's initial examinations confirmed Jonathan's observations. Every victim had been dispatched by a single surgically precise cut to the neck. The skill required to perform this on so many victims was extraordinary. But what unsettled him most was the condition of the bodies. Though dead for at least half a day, the skin of the victims remained strangely warm, with a pink flush that suggested life had only recently fled. The blood, too, was missing. Not pooled, not congealed, simply gone as though drained completely from their bodies. The investigation first turned toward the enslaved workers of Peaton Grove. Several were unaccounted for, including Isaac, the man whose skills with a blade had always raised unease, as well as Moses. A field hand, Sarah, a house servant, and Peter, Isaac's young assistant in the slaughterhouse. Yet when the search parties combed the quarters and outbuildings, their findings only deepened the mystery. Moses was found in his cabin, appearing as if asleep, yet decapitated with the same precision. Sarah lay in the kitchen garden, her body posed among the rows of vegetables she had tended. Peter was discovered in the slaughterhouse, slumped near the tools he once cleaned his head, placed neatly beside him. The fact that Isaac's companions had suffered the same fate as the Peaton family forced Sheriff Hawthorne to reconsider his theories. What began as a suspicion of rebellion or revenge now seemed something far more complex, an act that defied the logic of motive and human behavior, leaving only fear, silence, and questions no one could answer. The hunt for Isaac grew desperate as he remained the only soul missing from Peaton Grove. His cabin, already the site of Dr. Jonathan Peaton's dreadful discovery, yielded further horrors under closer examination. Beneath loose floorboards, investigators uncovered a set of journals, written in an elegant, educated hand that seemed entirely out of place for a man presumed to be illiterate. These volumes, spanning nearly 3 years, revealed an intelligence both meticulous and unnerving. What began as simple documentation of daily life on the plantation soon revealed itself as something far darker. The earliest entries from the autumn of 1844, when Isaac first arrived, described the household with almost clinical objectivity. He noted mealtimes, family routines, the habits of enslaved workers, and even architectural quirks of the house itself. At first it read like the notes of a detached observer cataloging the workings of an estate. Yet as the pages turned, the tone shifted. By 1845, Isaac was no longer merely recording, he was experimenting. He tested how people reacted to disruptions so slight they seemed trivial. In one instance, he wrote of moving a vase in the parlor 6 inches to the left, then documented Margaret Peaton's unease when she noticed something was amiss but could not explain why. Another entry described his detailed mapping of the house at night. He had learned which floorboards creaked, which hinges groaned, and precisely when each member of the family stirred in their sleep. These were not the idle musings of an uneducated laborer. They were the calculated observations of a mind treating human lives as specimens. By the time Professor Marcus Aldrich, the family's tutor, assisted in translating the journals for Sheriff Hawthorne, the disturbing progression was undeniable. Isaac's writings advanced from cataloging behavior to studying how people could be manipulated, conditioned, and controlled without their knowledge. Interspersed with these accounts were illustrations, intricate anatomical drawings that would not have looked out of place in a surgeon's manual. Every muscle, every vein, every bone was rendered with a precision, suggesting years of study, the kind of expertise that should have been far beyond Isaac's reach. The realization that Isaac had been planning, observing, and preparing for years chilled even the most hardened men in Cumberland County. These journals did not just explain how the massacre had been possible. They raised an even more terrifying question. Who exactly was Isaac, and how had a man enslaved since birth come to possess the mind of a surgeon, the discipline of a scientist, and the patience of a predator? The deeper investigators dug into Isaac's past, the more impossible his story became. His journals at Peaton Grove showed the hand of a man with knowledge that no enslaved person in antebellum Virginia should have possessed. Precise medical sketches, detailed anatomical notes, and records of behavior more akin to a trained scientist than a plantation laborer. Professor Aldrich, tasked with deciphering Isaac's writings, began cross-checking his supposed origins and quickly uncovered troubling inconsistencies. Fielding Crawford, Isaac's previous master, had claimed that Isaac was born on his Prince Edward County plantation, yet parish records contained no baptism, no listing in the birth ledgers, nothing to confirm his existence before 1842. Even more troubling, enslaved men and women who had lived their entire lives on Crawford's land swore they had never seen Isaac until just a few years before his sale to Cornelius Peaton. It was as though he had appeared suddenly fully formed, his past obscured. When Aldrich pressed further, he discovered testimony from Dr. Samuel Hutchinson, a physician who had long treated the enslaved community at Crawford's estate. Hutchinson remembered Isaac vividly, not as a simple laborer, but as an assistant whose knowledge of anatomy rivaled that of trained doctors. He recalled Isaac suturing wounds with flawless technique, dissecting livestock with surgical precision, and in several cases, saving lives during emergencies when Hutchinson himself faltered. Yet Hutchinson admitted something about Isaac unsettled him deeply. While others in the room showed horror or compassion in the face of pain, Isaac remained detached, studying each case as though suffering itself were a subject for cold observation. More alarming still were Hutchinson's private notes, discovered years later, which suggested that Isaac's departure from Crawford's plantation had been precipitated by quiet suspicion. 3 enslaved individuals had died within months of one another, deaths attributed publicly to illness. Yet Hutchinson's examinations revealed a chilling similarity. Each bore a small, nearly invisible puncture wound behind the left ear, a wound so precise that only someone with intimate surgical knowledge could have inflicted it. Hutchinson believed a thin blade had been slipped directly into the brainstem, causing instant, silent death. He had raised his concerns with Crawford, but the planter, unwilling to risk scandal or the loss of labor, chose instead to rid himself of Isaac, quickly selling him at a reduced price. Sheriff Hawthorne's inquiries broadened to other counties, and soon a pattern emerged. In Chesterfield County, records showed that Isaac had been briefly owned by Benjamin Curthers in 1843, before being transferred to Crawford. Curthers, reluctant at first to speak, eventually admitted that during Isaac's short stay, several of his strongest laborers had died unexpectedly. Each death on the surface seemed natural. But taken together, the pattern was too sharp to ignore. Isaac, it seemed, had moved quietly through Virginia's plantation system, leaving in his wake unexplained deaths, whispered fears, and masters eager to pass him on before questions grew too loud. By the spring of 1847, the massacre at Piton Grove was not just a singular horror. It was the culmination of a dark trail stretching back years, perhaps decades, carried out by a man whose origins and training remained a mystery no record could fully explain. The pattern of Isaac's killings became impossible to ignore. Just as on Crawford's plantation, the dead in Chesterfield bore the same telltale mark, a tiny puncture wound hidden behind the ear, delicate enough to escape casual notice, but deadly enough to silence life instantly. Benjamin Curthers admitted he had grown wary after watching Isaac's behavior around the corpses. While grief and reverence had shaped the responses of others, Isaac stood apart, his eyes scanning each body as though it were a puzzle, his hands hovering with the precision of a surgeon. The moment that sealed Curthers' fear came one night, when he caught Isaac bent over a woman's body, instrument in hand, studying her with a detachment more chilling than grief. When pressed for an explanation, Isaac had simply said he was examining the effects of death on human tissue. Within days, Curthers arranged for Isaac to be sold. The mounting evidence suggested that Isaac's time in Virginia had been marked by an escalating trail of methodical killings. Sheriff Hawthorne, alarmed by the possibility that one man could be responsible for so many silent deaths, coordinated with sheriffs across neighboring counties. Together, they established a network to track Isaac's movements, fearing that his escape from Piton Grove marked only the beginning of a larger threat. The investigation's trajectory changed entirely when Dr. Jonathan Piton received a knock at the door of his temporary quarters in Cumberland Courthouse. His visitor, Samuel Woodson, a free black blacksmith from Farmville, claimed to know Isaac from a time long before he appeared on Virginia's plantations. What he shared unraveled the mystery of Isaac's origins and recast him not as a man born into bondage, but as someone who had once walked free. Woodson insisted that Isaac had lived in Philadelphia as Isaac Thornton, a free man employed as an assistant to Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a respected anatomist and surgeon known for his pioneering work in dissection and surgical technique. Thornton's early promise had been undeniable. But according to Woodson, his fascination with anatomy veered into dangerous obsession. Where Whitfield sought knowledge to heal, Thornton saw something else, an art form hidden within the human body. Whitfield discovered Thornton conducting unauthorized experiments in the anatomy laboratory, not dissections for study, but grotesque manipulations of corpses twisted into arrangements that served no medical purpose. Thornton had defended his actions as explorations of the artistic possibilities of human anatomy. Speaking of flesh and bone as though they were marble and clay, Whitfield dismissed him immediately, barring him from the college. Yet the scandal didn't end there. Within weeks, several cadavers vanished from the laboratory. Soon after, 3 bodies of the recently deceased turned up in abandoned Philadelphia buildings, posed in ways that suggested Thornton had been practicing his art on real people. Woodson's account stunned Dr. Piton and Sheriff Hawthorne alike. Isaac was not simply an unusually skilled enslaved man. He was a free-born northerner whose intellect had curdled into madness, a man who crossed state lines and systems of power, leaving behind a trail of horrors. His presence in Virginia was no accident. It was the continuation of an obsession that had begun years earlier in Philadelphia, an obsession with turning death itself into a form of expression. The revelations from Samuel Woodson reframed everything investigators thought they knew about Isaac. Philadelphia authorities had once sought him in connection with the theft of cadavers and the grotesque staging of bodies, but he had disappeared before they could act. Woodson believed the explanation lay not in his escape north, but in his capture while trying to flee south. With his light complexion, ambiguous features, and no papers proving his free status, Isaac Thornton, trained anatomist, turned macabre. Experimenter may have been mistaken for a runaway and sold into bondage. That theory explained the otherwise impossible blend of education and enslavement that defined his life. For Dr. Jonathan Peyton Woodson's account was both chilling and illuminating. If Isaac's years of servitude had fused his intellectual obsessions with a personal hatred, then the massacre at Petong Grove was not simply murder. It was a carefully staged act of retribution, crafted with surgical precision and carried out as though it were a performance. The absence of chaos, the strange tableau, the silence, it all pointed to someone who believed he was composing a final statement. Even as Cumberland County reeled, fresh reports poured in from neighboring plantations. In Buckingham County, livestock were discovered slaughtered, their carcasses arranged in spirals and grids patterns, with no practical explanation. In Charlotte County, several enslaved workers were found dead in their cabins, each bearing the same almost invisible wound behind the ear. Most disturbing of all was a case from Nottoway County. An entire plantation family had vanished without a trace. Their house showed no signs of forced entry or violence, but journals and discarded notes suggested the victims had been stalked for weeks before their disappearance, as though hunted by someone who studied every detail of their lives before striking. Sheriff Hawthorne escalated the manhunt, deploying search parties across central Virginia. They combed through abandoned barn cellars and caves, seeking any trace of the fugitive. Yet Isaac seemed always a step ahead. Witnesses who claimed to have seen him gave conflicting descriptions. Some swore he was a towering man with pale gray eyes. Others recalled someone of middling height, quiet and forgettable. His ability to slip into different guises only deepened the fear that he could be anywhere watching, preparing. Meanwhile, Professor Aldrich pressed deeper into the journals retrieved from Isaac's cabin. What he uncovered turned the case from horrifying to unearthly. Isaac's later writings described the Petong Grove massacre not as revenge, but as his final experiment. He wrote of death not as an end, but as a medium human beings, as raw material for a composition. The way he arranged the family, the servants, even the enslaved workers, each was a piece in a grotesque tableau, meant to reveal, as he put it, the aesthetic potential of mortality. His sketches left little doubt. The killings had been rehearsed in his mind, each placement carefully envisioned long before the night of blood. But perhaps most alarming were the cryptic references woven into the margins of his journals. He wrote of disciples and fellow students of the art, vague mentions that hinted he was not alone. The idea that Isaac was in communication with others who shared his obsession, that he might be part of a hidden network of men and women scattered across the country, transformed the investigation from a local tragedy into a specter of something much larger. If Isaac Thornton had followers, then the massacre at Petong Grove may have been only the beginning. Just when Cumberland County believed the nightmare could not deepen, it did. And before we go further, if this story has you on edge, share it with a friend who loves the darkest corners of history. Hit that like button to support more stories like this, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this tale of calculated terror. The turning point in the search for Isaac came from Father O'Sullivan, the Irish priest known across the countryside for tending to Catholic families in scattered farmsteads. On one of his monthly circuits, he crossed paths with a group of 4 travelers dressed as itinerant preachers. Their appearance was unremarkable, but their manner unnerved him. At their head was a tall man with pale eyes who steered the conversation toward theology, death, resurrection, and the state of the body once the soul departed. What disturbed the priest most was not only the man's questions, but his answers. He spoke of anatomy with the ease of a physician, but his fixation was not healing, it was artistry. He claimed divine visions had called him to fashion living sculptures from human flesh works that would free souls from the confines of mortality and unite them more perfectly with their Creator. O'Sullivan left the meeting shaken, certain the man was Isaac. Worse, he believed Isaac was no longer alone. The priest reported that the group had been heading toward Powhatan County, claiming they planned a revival meeting to reveal their new spiritual path. Sheriff Hawthorne moved quickly, alerting neighboring authorities and preparing a pursuit. But before his men could set out, a message arrived that froze every heart in Cumberland. Colonel William Randolph, a prominent plantation owner, had sent an urgent plea for help. What awaited at his estate, he wrote, was nothing short of the most monstrous crime ever committed in Virginia. When lawmen arrived, they found Randolph's colonial mansion transformed into something grotesque, a gallery of the dead. In the parlor, 17 members of the Randolph household had been arranged around the dining table, their heads neatly severed and set upon china plates as though they were feasting upon themselves. Candles flickered across polished wood, throwing shadows that made the grisly dinner resemble a scene of twisted celebration. But the ballroom revealed Isaac's most macabre creation yet. There the bodies of 32 enslaved men and women had been arranged in elegant dancing poses. Their heads had been replaced with those of the Randolph family, grotesquely creating the vision of an integrated gathering that Virginia society would never have tolerated in life. In death, Isaac had staged what he saw as a grand social harmony, an obscene parody of freedom, equality, and festivity. The Randolph massacre made one thing terrifyingly clear. Peyton Grove had not been Isaac's final experiment. It had only been his opening act. The Randolph Plantation Massacre revealed the full evolution of Isaac's madness. The carefully staged scenes could not have been the work of a single man. Dr. Jonathan Peyton, examining the evidence alongside law enforcement, confirmed what Father O'Sullivan had already feared: Isaac was no longer alone. At least 3 others had assisted him, disciples who shared in his vision and labored under his command. The sheer scale and precision of the staging, from the dinner tableau to the ballroom of the dead, demanded hours of work, perhaps days, executed with chilling patience. But even more terrifying than the staging was the shift in Isaac's methods. Where the Peyton Grove victims had died instantly, many of the Randolphs had been forced to linger. Dr. Peyton's examination revealed wounds designed not to kill outright, but to extend suffering, to prolong consciousness, so Isaac could witness and record the human mind grappling with death. This was no longer only about arrangement, it was about process, about experimenting with how far life could be stretched before it gave way. In the Randolph cellar, investigators found the heart of Isaac's operation, a field laboratory disguised as a root cellar. The chamber had been transformed into a surgeon's theater. Anatomical charts lined the walls. Tables were outfitted with restraints built with a carpenter's skill, and shelves held rows of instruments sharpened for purposes that were not healing. Among them were journals filled with notes describing anatomical studies conducted on the living. He detailed how different incisions affected consciousness, how long speech persisted after certain injuries, how awareness could be dragged out to the very brink before the final cut. Diagrams and sketches outlined arrangements for future works, turning human bodies into raw material for a series of grotesque exhibitions. Sheriff Hawthorne's men made the most alarming discovery of all this. Was not Isaac's endpoint, but merely one stage in a larger plan. Among the unused instruments were freshly delivered supplies, untouched and waiting. Maps of surrounding plantations were spread across a table annotated with routes, family schedules, and guard rotations, each property studied with the precision of a military campaign. At the top of the notes was a timeline meticulously plotted, laying out a summer of blood across central Virginia. Each massacre was described as a chapter in what Isaac called his treatise on the aesthetics of mortality. The next chapter had already been chosen. Isaac's notes identified the Carrington plantation in Cumberland County, less than 10 miles from Randolph's estate. The attack was scheduled for the following evening, timed to coincide with a dinner party that would ensure every member of the family and many of their guests would be gathered in one place. Sheriff Hawthorne acted immediately, dispatching riders to warn the Carringtons and mobilizing the largest manhunt Virginia had ever seen. The race to stop Isaac Thornton had begun. The Carrington operation was meant to be a trap, but Isaac turned it into a stage. By dusk, the plantation was ringed with armed men from 5 counties, hidden among the trees and outbuildings, waiting for their quarry. The dinner table was set, and Colonel James Carrington, ever the soldier, held his family and guests steady, determined to lure Isaac into a fatal mistake. For a time, everything seemed quiet, too quiet. Then came the sound of faint scratching beneath the floorboards, at first dismissed as the creaks of an old house. But when Elizabeth Carrington remarked that it seemed to be coming from directly under her chair, the room stiffened with unease. Before anyone could move, planks of the dining room floor split open with a splintering crack, and 4 figures burst upward into the candlelight. Isaac and his disciples had tunneled beneath the house itself, bypassing guards and patrols to strike from within. The man who emerged was almost unrecognizable. Isaac's once clean-controlled presence had given way to something feral. His hair hung in matted tangles, his clothing soaked in fluids that carried the stench of slaughterhouses and graves. His pale eyes blazed with a kind of fevered devotion, not the cold detachment of a surgeon, but the exaltation of a zealot. Behind him came 3 followers, 2 black men who bore the hardened look of field laborers, and 1 white man whose accent and bearing suggested he had once been an overseer. Together they moved with startling unity, each gesture practiced, each motion rehearsed like actors in a deadly performance. The assault was unlike anything Cumberland County had ever seen. Isaac did not strike swiftly and silently as at Peaton Grove or Randolph. Instead, he and his disciples drew the scene out, turning the attack into a twisted spectacle. With blades in hand, they forced the guests to watch as their companions were cut, bound, and arranged, all while speaking in tones of reverence, as though they were presiding over a ritual rather than a massacre. Witnesses later recalled Isaac's voice rising above the chaos, delivering what sounded like a sermon, praising the aesthetic purity of mortal transformation, as if death itself had become his gospel. For the first time, Isaac abandoned shadows and secrecy. This was no hidden slaughter or carefully arranged aftermath. It was performance, an act of horror carried out in real time, before the eyes of terrified victims and armed men waiting to strike. And in that moment, every officer and guest realized the same terrible truth. Isaac Thornton had ceased to be a fugitive. He had become something far more dangerous, a prophet of death, determined to spread his doctrine through spectacle and blood. The ambush at the Carrington plantation turned into a 2-hour nightmare that revealed Isaac Thornton's descent into full delusion. The lawmen hidden across the property had prepared for an attack from outside, never imagining that Isaac would tunnel under the house itself. With the fugitives emerging in the middle of the dining room, guns trained from the windows suddenly became useless. One misaimed shot could kill the very guests they were meant to protect. Inside, Isaac commanded the room like a deranged maestro. He arranged his disciples with precision, gave orders with calm authority, and spoke to his captives as though they were pupils in a lecture hall. The killings were not immediate. Instead, he wove his violence into something that resembled performance. He interrogated the guests about their beliefs in mortality, the soul and the nature of existence. To him, fear was simply another tool or raw material as vital as flesh. Witnesses later described how Isaac forced the assembled men and women to examine the bodies of two guests he had already slain. He pointed to their limbs, their postures, and the stillness of their features, explaining the aesthetic of each position. He insisted that in death the body became clay, and that his task was to shape it into beauty that life itself could never achieve. His disciples, nodding along like devoted acolytes, reinforced his arguments. It was clear that his philosophy, death as art, murder as sculpture, had become more than an obsession. It was now a creed. Dr. Jonathan Peaton, watching from outside, realized that Isaac was no longer merely a killer. He had built a framework, an ideology that could recruit others and outlast him. The massacre was not just an act of violence, it was meant to be a demonstration, a sermon in flesh. The turning point came, when Colonel James Carrington, steady even in terror, executed a signal they had prepared in advance. By shifting his hands across the tablecloth in deliberate patterns, he alerted the concealed officers that Isaac and his followers had gathered into a formation vulnerable to coordinated fire. In an instant, the trap reversed. Gunfire shattered the windows as men stormed the dining room from three sides. Isaac, in the middle of explaining the mechanics of a throat incision to Mrs. Carrington, never had the chance to finish his sentence. Multiple rifle balls tore into his chest, dropping him where he stood. His three disciples tried to seize their captives as shields, but the careful positioning of the lawmen made escape impossible. In seconds, the room was engulfed in smoke and screams, then silence. Isaac and his disciples lay dead among the bodies. They had desecrated their blood, pooling together on the floor in one final tableau. Chaotic, unintended, and utterly unlike the compositions Isaac had so painstakingly arranged in life. The immediate threat was over. But the questions he left behind, his origins, his methods, and the unsettling network hinted at in his journals would haunt Virginia for months and perhaps years to come. The aftermath of Isaac Thornton's death only deepened the horror of what he had left behind. In the days that followed, lawmen and physicians pored over his journals and the contents of his field laboratories. What they uncovered was staggering. Evidence tied Isaac and his disciples to deaths and disappearances across 6 Virginia counties, stretching back nearly 4 years. Even the most cautious estimates placed their number of victims above 100, an unfathomable tally that marked Isaac as one of the most prolific killers in early American history. But Isaac's reach extended well beyond Virginia. Among the notes and sketches were letters, correspondence from sympathizers and would-be followers scattered across North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. These messages confirmed that Isaac had been building something larger than a single cult. He was recruiting, planting his philosophy in others who were ready to embrace his doctrine of death as art. To some, he was not a fugitive butcher, but a teacher, an apostle of a new kind of artistic truth. Southern law enforcement coordinated in an unprecedented effort to track down these contacts. Arrests were made as far south as Charleston, while others fled into the wilderness of the Western Territories, beyond the reach of courts and sheriffs. Some were linked to murders that bore Isaac's unmistakable signature, silent deaths, marked by surgical precision bodies arranged into grotesque displays. But many others vanished before they could be questioned. The psychological shock was nearly as damaging as the killings themselves. Plantation owners across Virginia and beyond responded with paranoia and fear. Guard patrols were doubled, curfews imposed, and enslaved communities watched with suspicion, even when no evidence tied them to Isaac's circle. The very idea that someone with his intellect and training could infiltrate their world, live among them, and strike with such precision created a sense of vulnerability that poisoned social relations for years. Perhaps most chilling of all was the discovery that Isaac's philosophy had resonated with both the enslaved and the free. His journals contained letters praising his works, some written in crude hands, others in the polished style of educated men. These correspondents spoke of the beauty in his tableau, the truth in his vision, and their desire to learn his methods. Isaac's words had outlived him, seeding a doctrine of violence as creative expression. When Virginia officials compiled the final investigative report, they moved swiftly to bury it. The findings were classified, sealed in courthouse archives, and forgotten in the chaos of the Civil War. It was only decades later, when the documents resurfaced, that the true scale of Isaac Thornton's crimes and the terrifying reach of his ideas came fully into view. Even then, one question remained unanswered. Who was Isaac really? Despite every effort, his origins and true identity remained obscured, his life story as fragmented and unsettling as the horrors he left behind. Samuel Woodson's testimony placed Isaac's origins in Philadelphia, but the trail dissolved under scrutiny. No records of an Isaac Thornton with his description ever appeared in Pennsylvania archives. That gap left investigators torn between two theories. Either Isaac had been a free and educated black man who deliberately entered the slave system to mask his crimes and access vulnerable victims, or he had been a man of mixed heritage, possibly even white, who used his ambiguous appearance to slip in and out of identities as it suited his purposes. What remained undeniable was his education. Isaac's mastery of anatomy, his cold understanding of human psychology, and his ability to manipulate both individuals and entire communities pointed to formal training far beyond what was thought possible for someone enslaved in Virginia. He had studied not only the body, but the mind, blending them into a framework of control and cruelty that made his crimes possible. The most chilling conclusion of the sealed report was that Isaac's case may not have been unique. His correspondence hinted at others who shared his beliefs and methods scattered across the South. These individuals, hidden within the plantation system, could use the same lack of documentation, the same constant buying and selling of human beings to conceal their movements and commit atrocities undetected. Investigators recommended broad surveillance and greater cooperation between counties, warning that Isaac's artistic killings might only have been the beginning of a larger, more organized phenomenon. The legacy of Isaac's crimes rippled far beyond Cumberland County. His campaign exposed a truth the plantation elite had long refused to acknowledge, that enslaved individuals, or those passing as such, could possess intellect, planning ability, and autonomy capable of challenging the system itself. His ability to assume new identities, infiltrate estates, and exploit the very networks of slavery revealed deep weaknesses in the social order. Plantation owners responded with paranoia, tightening controls, and amplifying suspicion in ways that poisoned relationships for decades. And yet, the most unsettling part of Isaac's story lay not in mystery or superstition, but in its banality. There was nothing supernatural at work. His atrocities were the product of human intelligence, sharpened by education, twisted by obsession, and given fertile ground by a system that made people into property. Isaac's story is a reminder that evil often hides behind the ordinary, that the most terrifying monsters are not creatures of folklore, but people who seem rational, intelligent, and disciplined until their intent is revealed. So, what do you think? Was the truth of Isaac's identity and motives fully uncovered, or does part of the mystery remain buried in history? Let me know in the comments, and share which forgotten stories or local mysteries you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoyed this tale, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with a friend who loves the dark side of history. Remember, the darkest chapters are often the ones deliberately erased. And together, we'll keep pulling them back into the light. See you in the next video.